Good afternoon, everyone. This is Jason Jordan, APA's Director of Policy, joining you to talk about August Congressional Recess Advocacy. We're a few days into the month of August and about a week into the long congressional recess. It's an important month for communicating our issue agenda to members of Congress while they're back home. So Emily Pazzi, my colleague, and I are going to spend the next few minutes talking to you about what we have available in terms of resources for you to be an effective advocate during this important recess period, and looking forward to some other opportunities later on in the year to continue to advance an agenda related to infrastructure. Is going to be the focus of our conversation today. If you could advance to the next slide, please. So we're going to focus some time today on giving you a briefing on where things stand with some critical transportation and infrastructure legislation on Capitol Hill to prepare you for August recess. Before we jump into that, just wanted to highlight a couple of things. One, a recording of the webinar will be available online so that you can access the slides later on. You'll be getting an email with a direct link. It'll also be posted on the APA website. We certainly want you to ask us any questions. So you should see a chat box on the side of your screen where you can enter your questions. We'll be taking those questions at the end of the webinar, so please let us know what's on your mind. Any questions would be great. And I wanted to highlight a couple of particular opportunities coming up. For those of you participating in Planners Day on Capitol Hill, and certainly I hope that will be everyone, we're going to have an advanced online briefing, so another webinar format like this one, but focused specifically on what's happening on Planners Day on Capitol Hill. And then, of course, our APA Policy and Advocacy Conference coming up in just over a month's time. I hope you can all join us here in the DC area for that event, which will include Planners Day on Capitol Hill. A lot of sessions focused on the subject of today's webinar, transportation and infrastructure, but other issues as well. It's a terrific opportunity to join with your planning colleagues and hear from policymakers and other influential voices in setting the public policy context for the planning that happens around the country. So do hope you will join us for that conference. It's always a terrific opportunity for our advocates to make their voices heard, to get lots of training and lots of insights on critical issues. So with that, let's jump into today's call. We're going to cover a number of things. We're going to look at the status of appropriations, so the funding process, the annual funding process for key infrastructure programs, particularly in the transportation and housing arenas. We're going to talk about the status of the FAST Act reauthorization, including key committees involved in those efforts and legislative next steps, so you know kind of what's coming up on those fronts. We'll talk about our issue advocacy, our asks for the recess period, and then go into advocacy resources to get you all prepared and engaged over the course of the next month, and then your questions and discussion at the end of the program. So the two issues that we are focusing on for this recess period are very much interrelated. And we're going to talk a little bit here about the distinctive characteristics of each one. But there are two linked topics here. One is the annual appropriations process, particularly for the THUD bill that covers the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There are a lot of the discretionary programs are funded here that affect critical community planning and infrastructure programs. And then the second piece is the reauthorization of the nation's surface transportation law. That's the FAST Act. That's due for reauthorization at the end or September of next year, but work is unfolding on that. So now is a particularly important opportunity to engage on advocacy on both of those issues. So let's start with sort of an examination of what's included here in these categories. Firstly, we have on the reauthorization side, the policy components. So there are committees, and I'll touch on exactly which committees in just a second, who are beginning the process of assembling the policies that will go into the FAST Act reauthorization. There'll be provisions that cover highway programs, transit programs, how planning operates, all of the various programs that are included in surface transportation. The bill provides the structure, the guidance, the requirements, and sets funding levels. But there's a second piece that is specifically related to the funding. So there's this category of activities around the policies and the structure of the programs, and then a second piece that focuses on how the funding actually is put in place. So for instance, you could look at the policy side of the bill to see how much a grant program or a formula program is funded, but the actual mechanism, either the trust fund or in the tax code, that is the subject of a slightly separate set of jurisdictional issues. A different committee will be working on the funding stream for that. But the two pieces work together, and they eventually form one bill that addresses both the policy and the funding for reauthorization. That is legislatively separate from the annual appropriations process. So on the reauthorization side, most of those programs are funded through the Transportation Trust Fund, through the gas tax into the trust fund, and it's guaranteed funding out to pay for all of the various policy provisions and the various programs that are included in the reauthorization. However, some programs are funded on an annual basis, and that's discretionary. So Congress can raise or lower the level of funding through the appropriations process for some programs. On the transportation side, that particularly affects the BUILD program, which is the new name of the Tiger Grant program, and transit capital grants, the New Starts and Small Starts program. Those are funded through appropriations as opposed to trust fund programs. So you can see how these asks and these issues connect together. So let's start, if you go to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the appropriations process and where we stand with that. Earlier this year, the House of Representatives approved their version of the Transportation and HUD bill for the next fiscal year. Of course, both the House and the Senate have to take action, and that measure has to then be signed by the White House. The Senate has not taken action, and in part, they were waiting for a spending agreement to be hashed out between Congress and the White House. That needed to be put in place in order to set a new overall level of funding for the total appropriations process. Previously, Congress had agreed to a 2-year baseline for spending. That agreement expired, and when it expired, it allowed the provisions of the Budget Control Act and sequestration to kick back in potentially for this year, which would have required very deep and dramatic and mandatory cuts to programs. That was an unappealing prospect for all the participants involved, and so there was a desire to set new baselines. And there were some priorities that the White House had for, particularly on the defense side of funding, and then so there was a negotiation process about at what level to raise the overall level of spending for both defense and non-defense programs. They were able to reach a new agreement that covers FY20 as well as FY21 to essentially allow the appropriators to then begin putting in place the more specific funding levels program by program. So we have the House that has already taken action, and you can see their funding levels on the screen. The Senate now is just beginning that process. So the agreement was signed by the President just prior to Congress leaving for recess. So work is now happening at the staff level to begin preparing those bills. When the Senate comes back right after Labor Day, they will actually begin moving those appropriation bills through committee and ultimately to the floor. So what we're going to see in the month of September is the Senate beginning to take action, but with a very hard deadline. September 30th is the end of the federal fiscal year. So what we're perhaps going to see, and I think very likely going to see, would be some sort of continuing resolution, which essentially gives Congress more time. It would avert shutting down the government artificially on the 30th and provide some space for completing work on these individual bills. That's probably going to take the form of what's colloquially known in Congress as a minibus, as opposed to an omnibus. An omnibus wraps everything together. The minibus strategy essentially takes 3 or 4 spending bills at a time, links them together to build political support, essentially, to allow them to move forward. We don't yet know how the THUD bill might be bundled with other program areas, but it typically gets bundled with a number of them when this strategy is taken. So we don't quite know what the Senate's going to do. They haven't sort of completely set the stage with spending levels by bill area, so THUD doesn't have their allocation defined fully yet, but that's going to happen, and the committee will move forward with activity in September. So as we think about advocacy on the appropriations process in August, we're sort of looking forward to addressing what the Senate is likely to do in September, and then ultimately what the negotiations become between the two chambers and with the White House on funding levels. The big picture here is that we want to see the Congress continue to invest in infrastructure and communities to raise the level of funding for key programs. What I pulled out here on the slide are 4 of the main programs that APA has advocated on behalf of for a number of years because they're so central to the work that planners do in transportation and housing that are discretionary funded through the appropriations process. And I think the baseline message here is that we would like to see at least the House pass funding levels for those 4 programs adopted in the Senate bill and then ultimately reflected in the final package, which would include $1 billion for the BUILD program, full funding for transit capital investment grants, the New Starts program primarily, Community Development Block Grant Program at $3.6 billion, and then the Home Program at $1.75. That represents modest growth in those program areas and helps build on some of the momentum over the last couple of funding cycles where there's been some growth, needed growth, to address housing, community development, and transportation investment. So let's turn now to the FAST Act reauthorization process. I'll sort of set the stage a little bit in terms of where we are. As I mentioned before, the current bill, the current law, expires on September 30th of next year, which seems like a long way away, but in fact, it takes quite a while to put these bills together and to build the consensus and the political will to enact a significant reauthorization. So Congress has begun working on this. There have been hearings already happening across this year. And in fact, the very first votes on a piece of reauthorization started in the Senate, with the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee moving forward their piece of a reauthorization bill. So what you will see begin to happen is that the various committees that have a component of this, and the main ones are listed there on the screen, will begin drafting, debating, and ultimately voting on their section of the bill. So on the Senate side, what we have coming out of the Environment and Public Works Committee largely addresses overall funding levels and program areas for the planning program, for all of the highway programs, but not the transit program. The transit program is actually handled by the Senate Banking Committee, so they will now begin work assembling their bill, and then those bills will eventually be merged together to form one package that will move to the Senate floor. The Commerce Committee has some jurisdiction, particularly over some of the safety programs and some of the research programs. And the big piece that is going to be one of the main challenges will come through the Finance Committee, and that is how do we pay for what's being written in the other committees. On the House side, it's similar, although the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee has jurisdiction over both highways and transit, so you'll get one policy package there, and then the Ways and Means Committee will focus on the tax implications of this. You've heard a lot already in this Congress about an infrastructure package and ideas for a brand new program, a comprehensive program. That is a separate issue from this particular reauthorization. But when you think about it, and if you hear, if you talk to a lot of members of Congress, they will reflect this point of view as well. Really, the likely infrastructure package that we're going to get is a combination of appropriations in this particular reauthorization because of the scope and scale of those activities. But you may see some other infrastructure pieces debated, but the main action is going to be on the FAST Act reauthorization, and we're going to continue to see over the coming months committees begin assembling legislation. And I'll talk more here about what we've seen come out of the Senate so far. The legislation that was unanimously approved by the EPW committee is called America's Transportation Infrastructure Act. As I mentioned before, it doesn't cover the transit programs, but it covers much territory. So there's a lot that could be said about the specifics of the bill. I'm only going to touch on a handful of key elements. I would suggest, if you're looking for a little bit more detail, we put up a blog post on the APA website providing a little bit more background and detail about the reauthorization process overall, and specifically what's contained in this particular bill. So I'll highlight just a few things. For the first time ever, the legislation, the reauthorization legislation, would include an entire title, so an entire section of the bill devoted to climate change and called out and labeled as such. The climate title has a variety of provisions, but some of the most significant ones would be some new grant funding that would focus on electric vehicles, particularly the charging and fueling infrastructure for those. Another program that would be a carbon emission reduction incentive program that would be a combination of formula funding and competitive grants, as well as some resiliency provisions aimed at ensuring that the transportation infrastructure investments paid for in the bill can effectively be resilient to potential extreme weather events. There are other resiliency provisions sort of scattered throughout the bill, and that is an area of focus for the legislation overall. Another key area where APA has been involved for a long time is the Transportation Alternatives Program, the TAP program. This is the main pot of funding for biking and walking. This legislation maintains the overall scope of the formula programs, so there's no increase in the percentage of funding that goes into what's known as the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program. That's the main piece of funding that is sub-allocated out to metropolitan areas, but it does, within the scope of that set aside, increase the overall amount allocated for the TAP program, which would, have the net effect of increasing funding for TAP. It also has some reforms embedded in there to make the program a little bit more responsive to communities, particularly to small communities, providing greater access to TAP funding. And you'll see that reflected in a few places in the bill, and in part that's due to the fact that the EPW committee is chaired by Senator Barrasso from Wyoming, and so his sensitivity to rural interests in smaller towns, and federal lands and other issues particular to that state certainly come through in the bill. But the TAP expansion is something that APA and some coalition partners have worked on through what are known as marker bill legislation, individually introduced pieces of legislation that then get folded into large packages such as this one. There's some changes, modest changes in some respects to the planning title of the bill. In particular, there is a provision to eliminate fiscal constraint requirements for long-range plans, beyond the 4-year TIP timeframe. So that's a significant change. There's some other changes in transportation planning provisions that relate to enhancing consideration of equitable population representation on MPO governance bodies, MPO boards, and the encouragement of the use of social media and other web tools in the public participation process. Not mandates, but changes in that section. And then the last thing I would call your attention to are some data and autonomous vehicle provisions. The issue of how data is managed and infrastructure to infrastructure, vehicle to vehicle data programs are reflected in a couple of different ways in the legislation, certainly with an eye to what's happening with technological advances in transportation and providing a little bit more of a clearinghouse function to help communities understand implications and best practice in those areas. That too is something that APA has weighed in on through our policy principles on autonomous vehicles, through our new surface transportation policy guide as well. So those are some of the key provisions in the bill. Again, if you want more detail, certainly would encourage you to take a look at the blog post, and we'll have more information coming out on the details of this as we go forward. There's certainly the opportunity to continue to advocate on these provisions, and I'll expand on this in a second, but essentially, even though the Senate committee has already voted, the House hasn't moved their bill at all through committee yet. So this gives us a point of comparison. So the things that we like about that Senate bill can be encouraged to be included in the House bill. If there are tweaks or modifications that would make the bill better in our view, then there's the opportunity to encourage that both on the floor of the Senate, which is a harder lift, but certainly to influence the scope and content of the House legislation. So what are we focused on as it relates to reauthorization advocacy? One of the tricky things about discussing these broad bills, these big reauthorization bills, is that they cover a lot of individual programs where we have a lot of specific interests and a lot of specific changes or suggestions or ideas, overall funding levels, formula, set-asides, etc. So what I want to do is sort of telescope back from some of those specifics for a second and just paint a picture of the big pillars, if you will, that will define our advocacy over the course of this recess, but really as we go forward. The first category relates to what I'm calling here sustainable funding, which is a recognition that we do believe that there needs to be more investment, but we also believe that we have to find a sustainable model for ensuring that those resources are actually available. And that means in the short term addressing the gas tax by increasing it, at least temporarily, until some other mechanism can be agreed upon, identified, and put in place. So if you go to the policy guide that APA adopted earlier this year, we specifically call out the need to shore up the trust fund through the existing gas tax mechanism as we look toward solutions that maybe work better than the gas tax going forward. There are provisions in the legislation that continue to advance VMT fee, other sorts of user fee models that could eventually be a supplement or a replacement to the gas tax. But shoring up that funding, increasing and shoring up that funding is one category. Secondly, we have obvious interests in advancing the role of transit, biking, and walking in this legislation, and ensuring that multimodal balance is there, that we're increasing support for the whole range of mobility options that people want and that communities need. So there'll be, specific areas of focus on the TAP program, for instance, but also as the Banking Committee begins their work, as the House Transportation Committee begins their work, focusing on bolstering public transportation provisions in the overall legislation. Thirdly, a recognition that climate and resiliency are critical components of this overall debate, and ensuring that there are good standards in there, that there are new funding streams available to help communities begin to address climate change, and also provisions to incorporate climate more into the planning process directly. The fourth category is a broad one, but it's that this bill really needs to be future focused, that this is an opportunity that is an important one to really look ahead at what's happening and likely to happen in the transportation space that's quite different from previous bills. That includes everything from what we're doing with data to autonomous vehicles, other kinds of micro-mobility options, for instance, that this bill represents a chance not just to continue the existing federal program, but to really make that federal program more responsive to where communities are heading, more forward-looking, and really to create a whole new vision for the federal role in transportation, what the transportation network can be. So those are the four areas where we're encouraging members and advocates to have conversations with their members of Congress, congressional staff, to help move the bill in that direction. We'll talk more about the advocacy side of this in just a second. So the road ahead, where are we headed with all of this? So as I mentioned before, the Senate, on the appropriation side, the Senate is going to begin work on their individual bills beginning in September. We will likely see those individual minibuses move forward. Likely also that there will need to be a little bit more time past September 30th with a CR, and then the negotiations, both between the House and the Senate, and then also with the White House, ultimately with the goal of reaching agreement on 2020 funding levels for these key programs. On the reauthorization side, we're going to see work begin in earnest in the House of Representatives through the committee process. Those other Senate committees are going to start swinging into gear. I do think we will not see action immediately on the funding side, because that's really where the hard work is going to be done here. If you just look for a second at that EPW vote, unanimous vote in committee, the bill was written in tandem. 2 Democrats and 2 Republicans were the primary drafters of the legislation. Pretty easy in the sense to come to an agreement on a lot of the policy provisions. It's going to be much harder, frankly, to resolve the funding issues, particularly since that is going to, require some hard look at the gas tax. So just as a matter of sequencing, I think we'll see the policy provisions move through committee before we see the funding provisions move through the Ways and Means Committee and the Finance Committee, respectively. But ultimately, this will move us toward new transportation legislation that will set the context for much of the transportation work that's done across the country. So let me try to answer the question that you may be asking, or questions you may be asking yourself. So why are we focused on this now? Certainly there are any number of issues that could be the focus of conversations over the course of the August recess, and why is this us? Why is it you? What's distinctive about planning and planners in this process? Well, on the issue of why now, I really do believe we're at a pivotal moment. On the appropriation side, we're looking at the fiscal year deadline in just a couple of months, where Congress has to take action. It's a chance to ensure those critical funding levels. We're also at the starting line in many ways for the other process, for reauthorization, where committees are now beginning to debate specific language, and that sets the overall framework for the debate that we're going to have over the course of the next year. So really important to get those ideas seeded in these early drafts, these early markups of legislation. And of course, it's pivotal too, because it's critical funding and policy that relates to planning. I would argue that probably no other single federal program has as many direct planning requirements and direct impacts on planning as the transportation bill does. Certainly, there are plenty of other planning requirements scattered across federal programs, but this is a significant one. And of course, the funding for transportation infrastructure and other kinds of infrastructure is vital for a lot of the implementation of local projects and local plans. So what's distinctive about our voice, about your voice in this process? Well, primarily, people know that planners are a critical stakeholder in this process because there's an entire title of the legislation that is specifically focused on planning, and you see planning referenced and reflected in many of the other components of the bill as well. I think that makes your voice important to policymakers because they know you are one of the sort of frontline implementation places, if you will, for this program. But it's broader than that. It's broader than just the fact that we're statutorily required to do transportation planning in a certain kind of way. I think planners also bring the ability to provide that local story behind how these programs actually come to life. The kinds of things that can be built, the kinds of things that are incorporated in the vision that's embedded in plans, to understand how to personalize and humanize these programs. You also have local connections. Planning often sits at a point of connecting citizens and advocates and local elected officials together. That's powerful, and congressional offices want to know sort of how those connections work and how those different parts of a coalition or parts of a community see these programs, and that relates to the comprehensive view that you provide. I think there's a growing recognition of something that planners have long well understood and promoted, which is that transportation doesn't exist in a vacuum, and that if you're a member of Congress concerned about affordable housing, for instance, or economic development or environmental protection or any number of other things, there's a connection here, and planners are very well positioned with that comprehensive view to understand how our transportation investments and our transportation policy relate to other things that are critical for the health, prosperity, and opportunity in communities. So that's why we want to take this August recess period to get you engaged as an advocate and to get you engaged specifically on the appropriations process and the reauthorization process because it's a critical moment for both of those issues. And with that, I want to transition over to talking about how we're going to actually bring this to life through your advocacy. And to do that, I'm going to turn the program over to my colleague, Emily Pazzi.
Thanks so much, Jason. Jason just gave you a really fantastic rundown on the policy issues at play here that we're going to be building on through our advocacy, but I'm going to dig into that advocacy and help to explain to you what the game plan is through this month, but beyond that, into September, during Planners Day on Capitol Hill, which takes place at the Policy and Advocacy Conference, and even past that through the end of the year. So APA can and does meet with members of Congress on your behalf regularly to talk about the things that we're talking with you all about today. But the real power is in hearing from the constituents, from you guys. And so, of course, that is why APA has our Planners Advocacy Network, which you all are members of. And that's why we are spending so much time and energy really digging into this with you so that you are able to deliver the best message you possibly can. So to get us started, what are we working toward? Pulling back everything that Jason just said from a 30,000-foot view, we are working toward policy changes. On an appropriation side, we're working toward increased funding that's spent more wisely on a range of mobility issues. We're also focused on identifying that sustainable, predictable funding mechanism to make sure that the resources are actually available that we need to implement those programs. And we're also talking about advancing key policy and program reforms, many of which Jason touched on in his remarks a few minutes ago. Now, as an organization, we are also really focused on making sure that our advocates are developing their relationships with elected officials. For those of you who've been in the advocacy space with us for some time, you know that you don't just reach out to your elected official one time and expect to get exactly what you're looking for. It's a long game. And it takes repeated outreach efforts to those members of Congress to really build that relationship with them and to make sure that they understand what you support and why they should support what you support. So I think it's worth reiterating something again that Jason touched on just briefly, and that's that planners in the planning community at large have a unique perspective on the issue of surface transportation reauthorization and appropriations for key infrastructure programs. You guys are the stewards of shared vision to take that long view and you understand what federal tools you need to achieve that specific local outcome. In this case, it's how transportation relates to other major efforts in your communities. And so really bringing that to life for elected officials is so important. The second piece is that you understand what the local impact is. You guys know of the stories and have your own personal stories, no doubt, about how these federal policies and these tools play out for good or for bad in your communities. That's exactly the kind of information that elected officials want to hear. We want to create that feedback loop, and we can't do that without you. You are also the local expert. You're certainly the planning expert, and Jason talked about being a key stakeholder a little bit ago in this webinar. Again, planning is referenced all over the surface transportation EPW bill that recently dropped. And so people have a reason to listen to you all. You also, again, are connected to your local community, and that cannot be emphasized enough. Finally, you're a constituent. Don't ever forget the value of that. The power of the vote is incredible. And elected officials, they're not going to know how you feel about this issue or any other issue unless you tell them. So it's important you weigh in now. So now that you all are hopefully on board with joining us in this advocacy effort over the next few months, I want to kind of take you on an advocacy roadmap of where we're headed. This kind of hits on some key congressional moments, but also some important EPA moments as well. August recess is the first of those. I really want you all to think about this quote unquote roadmap as individual building blocks. So August recess is that kind of foundational piece. This is when we're going to first make contact with elected officials about our positions and what we're looking for in terms of surface reauthorization and appropriations and how those two things work together. We are then going to focus in September on deepening that message and getting a little bit more specific in terms of our asks. We'll do that in person at Planners Day on Capitol Hill during the Policy and Advocacy Conference in Washington, D.C. Following Planners Day on Capitol Hill, we'll move into that time frame that Jason was describing, where a lot of the actual work is going to really get started from an appropriation standpoint. Again, likely to have a continuing resolution, and so work will be happening on that side, as well as a lot of the committee work on some of the policy pieces and also the funding pieces on surface transportation reauthorization, rather. So these are key moments in time, and we're going to dig into each one of these and what you can do specifically. So in terms of August recess, just first of all, what is August recess? I'm not sure that we've mentioned it so far. That's the time when senators and House members head back to their districts and states to hear from constituents like you. So they're in town hall meetings, they're taking in-person meetings, they're going to a lot of events, they're all over the community. They want to get as much face time as possible, and so they're really looking for feedback in this moment, which makes this time, this month of August and into a little bit of September, really critical for you all in terms of communicating your position on these issues. Just say a quick note, it does run, August recess runs until September 6th. Members are back in Washington, D.C. on September 9th, so we have some time to play with here in terms of your advocacy. For our purposes, today is the first day of August advocacy recess. Though the House and the Senate started their recess about a week ago, today is when rubber really hits the road at APA for our advocates. And this is exactly how we're going to do that. So we're going to be working with individual advocates on a email letter sending campaign. So our goal is to talk to our elected officials on both the reauthorization side and the appropriation side. Our main ask for reauthorization, of course, is to tell your House and Senate members what planners want to see in the next surface transportation law. And we've already pre-drafted a letter that lives in our Legislative Action Center on planning.org that breaks down exactly what that means. And you'll see if you go to the Legislative Action Center how that aligns with those four big picture kind of thematic areas that Jason touched on a few minutes ago. I'll repeat them now so everyone has them fresh in their mind. It's the need to increase sustainable and predictable funding. Federal transportation programs must do more to promote the transit, the biking and the walking piece, and working on transportation policies that have to make communities more resilient and address that climate change challenge. And then finally, making sure that our transportation legislation is forward-looking and helping communities to prepare for the future in terms of data, AVs, new technologies, et cetera. On the appropriation side, our main focus is right now to tell your senators to boost funding for those critical transportation programs that receive discretionary funding as a part of the larger Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Portfolio, or THUD as it's called. Now, throughout this process, our appropriations ask will evolve as progress on this advances, but for right now, this is our main focus. Now, we want to see our Planners Advocacy Network members send 1,000 letters to their House and Senate members for each of the reauthorization and the appropriations ask, which gets us to a combined total of 2,000 letters. That is our ultimate goal, and we have until September 6th to do so. So let's get to work on that front. One of the ways that we're going to encourage driving that kind of letter sending momentum is with a new Advocacy Day of Action. We've never done this before. This is the first ever Advocacy Day of Action for APA, and it's really pretty exciting. It's one day where we're going to be channeling all of our efforts in August, and that day is August 20th, to get our grassroots advocates here in the network, but also beyond the network, to send those letters to their members of Congress on reauthorization and appropriations. We are going to be encouraging a follow-up ask, a third ask, if you will, for folks who have yet to send either one of those letters that we just talked about. That ask will be forthcoming if you complete those 2 letters, and we hope we all do. But basically, that will be to encourage your colleagues to jump on board to send those letters. So it's one day, it's 3 asks, it's many voices working together to bolster APA's message and position. Now, once we move past August recess, as I said, the next big milestone for us is Planners Day on Capitol Hill on September 25th. And for folks on the phone who might be new to it or might never have attended a policy and advocacy conference, I highly recommend that you do, because this Planners Day on Capitol Hill portion of the program gets you in the room with your House and Senate members and their staff. It allows you to build that FaceTime with them, build that relationship with them, and it allows you to dive deeper into the issues and leverage those personal stories in a way that isn't always possible in an email or a phone call. So that face-to-face time is really critical, and this will be kind of that second foundational building block where you can dive deeper, really establish yourself as an expert with a clear position on these issues, and help your elected officials to understand why they should support your position on reauthorization and appropriations. Throughout the webinar, we've talked about a number of different resources that advocates can use to kind of shore up their policy knowledge and make sure that they're delivering the most effective message that they possibly can. I want to hit on a couple of those with you here. We've heard of references to the Surface Transportation Policy Guide. This was our newly adopted guide that the board approved actually just a few months ago. This really lays the foundation for all of the messaging and the policy positions that we are taking on reauthorization and appropriations. It's worth noting that the Surface Transportation Policy Guide was actually a result of a member-driven process that took about 2 years. So this guide really provides the comprehensive viewpoints of APA members and where you all stand on these issues. And so that's what informs our advocacy specifically. So it's a great document to dig into, of course, available on planning.org. We also have a number, we have a new blog piece that's out most recently from last week that really dives into the policy side and the advocacy road ahead of what we've talked about today. That's a great resource. Recommend you all sit with it, bookmark it, share it on your own social outlets to get other planners aware of the issues and help them understand why it is we're taking these positions and what you can do to ultimately shape the legislative outcome. There's also some new resources that are going to be coming out here by the end of the week. You're going to see a message about this in your Planners Advocacy Network email on Thursday. We're going to have some new legislative process videos that really just break down appropriations at a very basic level, as well as the reauthorization process, both in terms of the history of it and the road ahead, so that when you're working through your advocacy and you find yourself having questions about the process, these are good resources for you to refer back to. We're also going to be adding in a one-page brief that breaks down in kind of layman's terms what we are promoting as a part of our advocacy through the surface transportation reauthorization work that APA is doing. So again, all of this is available on planning.org /advocacy. You're going to get an email about it later in the week that gives you the direct link to where all of these exclusive network resources are, and we do hope you will use them often. Looking ahead, and I think we're about to move into the questions section, but I'll just say, again, you all you're a tremendous asset to APA. It's your voices that really help to advance the policy work at the federal level. And so it's so important that you engage in this process and that you encourage others to engage along with you as well. We will be sending out prompts throughout the month through our Planners Advocacy Network communications and other APA communications to make sure that you're making progress and to check in with you to see how you're doing if you need any support. Thank you again for all you do as advocates of APA. And with that, I think we're going to move on to the questions, and I'll throw it back to you, Jason.
Hey, thanks a lot, Emily. That's terrific. Certainly echo your comments about how critically important our advocates are and what a terrific job they do. We do have a few questions that have been submitted. I'm going to go through those now, but please, if you have questions or comments, feel free to post those. Had a question come in about what TAP stands for in the reauthorization bill. That's the Transportation Alternatives Program. Again, that's the program that is the primary funding source for biking and walking projects. It is a component of the set aside of funding that is provided directly to metropolitan areas. It's an area that APA has long been engaged in and supportive of, and certainly we continue to support not only the set-aside itself for TAP, but the increases that the legislation that was passed out at EPW call for. There's a question about the Planners Day on Capitol Hill scheduling process. So the way this works is when you register for the event, we will use your home address information to match you up with your congressional representatives, and we handle all of the scheduling for you. So there's all you have to do is the meeting itself, really. We'll handle the coordination with the offices and the coordination among advocates who are participating from the same state or district. So we try to make it absolutely as easy as possible for you to participate. There was a good suggestion on here that came in about a recent report that APA was part of on the Community Development Block Grant Program. APA is a longtime member of the CDBG Coalition, and that coalition produced a new report focused on the impact of CDBG funding and programs, as well as highlighting the need for those things. So certainly if CDBG advocacy is part of your message, that's a terrific resource. There was also a question on here a little bit about funding for sort of related infrastructure projects, things like streetscape enhancements, utility relocations, other kinds of project funds like that. There are provisions in a number of programs for different kinds of infrastructure. I won't go into all of that detail. I will say that APA has been very supportive of funding streams for a variety of kinds of transportation investment and infrastructure. I'll mention a couple of key things that are maybe newer in this particular bill. There's a new bridge program that's contemplated in here. There's some changes to some of the safety programs, which again is another way that some of that streetscape and related pedestrian infrastructure projects can be funded. There continues to be a significant focus on freight mobility, port operations in here. One of the priorities for Chairman Barrasso was some funding to address reducing collisions with wildlife. And so there are some funding streams available for that. That's hardly a comprehensive look. There's some planning funds for removal of certain kinds of infrastructure that causes barriers to mobility. There are a lot of different pockets of programs. It's useful maybe to take a look at some of the resources that Emily alluded to in terms of assessing, overall APA positions on these things, as well as an understanding of what's in this draft of the bill and maybe how it relates directly to some of the interests in your planning and your community. Just looking at the questions. There's a question here about ideas and suggestions for advocates who live in Washington, D.C., which both Emily and I do, so we understand the issue of the representation issues on Capitol Hill for D.C. residents. This is an interesting one. I mean, of course, D.C. has no Senate representation, but Delegate Norton, Eleanor Holmes Norton, who represents Washington, D.C., is a very senior member of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and in fact is chairing one of the subcommittees principally responsible for this legislation. So while she has limited abilities in terms of the overall, abilities to, she's still a delegate, not a full representative. but in this instance, she's going to be pivotal in terms of her role in drafting the legislation. So this is a terrific opportunity for DC advocates to be engaged with her office on behalf of good planning. I think that might be all of the questions that have come in. You see the email there that you can use on your screen. Do feel free, if there are other questions that you'd like to raise with us directly or clarifications, please do contact us. We're always happy to hear directly from our advocates. And again, this program is being recorded and will be posted and available for your use later on. We do hope you'll register and join us for the policy conference next month, and we appreciate your ongoing advocacy on behalf of good planning across the country. We look forward to working with all of you across this congressional recess to advance our interests and planning interests as we move forward with the reauthorization and appropriations process. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining us.